The search and recovery operations on Broad Peak have now been halted for the remainder of the 2026 season. And with that decision comes a painful reality. 3 climbers will remain on the mountain, and for how long? Nobody knows. Whether another expedition will one day return for them, whether a future recovery operation will become possible, or whether Broad Peak will keep them for decades, perhaps forever, is something no one can answer today. Mountaineering history is filled with stories like this. George Mallory and Andrew Irving disappeared high on Everest in 1924. Mallory's remains would not be found for another 75 years, while Irvine's fate remains one of the mountaineering's great mysteries for a century. And across Everest, K2, Broad Peak, and the other great mountains of the Himalaya and Karakoram, there are climbers who went up one season and simply never came home. For their families, an expedition may end. A rescue operation may be called off. The mountain may become silent again. But the waiting does not necessarily end with it. Somewhere below Broad Peak are families who now have to live with perhaps the hardest kind of loss, knowing that the person they loved is still somewhere on that mountain, but not knowing when or whether they will ever be brought back home. The helicopters have left. The rescuers are now descending. The climbing season is ending. Soon the camps will disappear and winter will return to Broad Peak. But 3 climbers will remain behind. And perhaps that is the most heartbreaking way to close the story of the Broad Peak 2026 disaster. Not with a rescue, not with complete closure, but with the 3 people still somewhere high on the mountain, waiting for a journey home that may come next year, many years from now, or perhaps never. Here's our final report on the Broad Peak 2026 expedition and the tragedy that unfolded on the mountain. What you are watching right now is the final journey of Pur Bahadur Yukta Gurung. Yukta Gurung's final homecoming was marked by a solemn Hindu and Buddhist funeral traditions. Many people were present, prayers, offerings, and rituals performed to honor him and guide him on his final journey. After everything that had happened on Broad Peak, after the avalanche, after days on the mountain, after the recovery operations, after the helicopters carried the deceased away from one of the most remote places on Earth, Yukta finally came home to Nepal. And here in Kathmandu, surrounded by families, friends, fellow mountaineers, and those who came to pay their respects, his final rites were performed. Yukta was cremated according to a Hindu tradition at Swayambhunath. My co-host knows Swayambhunath very well.
Swayambhu means also Shambhu in the Hindu countries, mostly in the communities. But Swayambhu means, Swam means by itself, automatic. Bhu means becoming the reality. So the one that becomes the reality by itself without any external help. So the creator becomes a creation. Swayambhu.
You just disappear back into where it is that you came from. And this is really what a recovery operation means in the end, giving a family the chance to perform the final rites. When we report these tragedies, we often use very clinical language. The body was recovered, the remains were evacuated, the climber was brought down. But behind those words is a family waiting far away. It's a terrible feeling knowing that the final rites, which are so important for certain spiritual values, are not able to be performed so the spiritual and emotional closure can actually be completed, so they can see their loved ones one last time for one final goodbye. For Yukta Gurung's family, that moment finally came. But for other families connected to Broad Peak, that closure was still not possible and still has not come. As of August 8th, the major recovery operation following the July 30th Broad Peak avalanche has effectively come to an end for the season. The mountain has become increasingly dangerous. Temperatures are changing and snow and ice continue to move. Avalanche and rockfall danger still remains, and the people who spent days risking their own lives recovering the climbers have now begun leaving the mountain. The helicopters have flown the bodies that could safely be brought down from the mountain. They've actually begun their journey home. And Broad Peak has become very quiet again. But unfortunately, not everybody came down. And before we talk about what remains on the mountain, we need to understand just how extraordinary this recovery operation actually was. Because I think this may become one of the most remarkable gut-wrenching stories to come out of the entire 2026 climbing season. Just a week ago, on July 30th, a massive avalanche struck climbers on Broad Peak. 10 people lost their lives. Among them was one of the most recognizable mountaineers in the world. They were Nirmal Purja, Pur Bahadur, Yukta Gurung, Nima Sherpa, Gayalu Sherpa, Kili Pembi Sherpa, widely known as Kilu, Noang Tindu Sherpa, Nadira Ahmed Abdullah Al-Harti of Oman, Wang Zhang of China, Sohail Saki of Pakistan, and American climber Mallory Geis. And once it became clear that these climbers had not survived, another mission began. The incredible recovery mission.
And this is where the story becomes almost as dangerous as the original accident itself.
Exactly, because the men who went back up Broad Peak were entering the same terrain that has just killed 10 people, and the mountain was still dangerously unstable. By July 31st, Pakistan Army helicopters were already involved. Initial bodies and remains were located. Climbers began moving onto the mountain. But the major high-altitude recovery effort developed over the following days. One of the most difficult operations took place actually on August 2nd. Several of the victims were located within a relatively concentrated area of the avalanche path. But one climber was much farther above them. Noang Tindu Sherpa. Drone reconnaissance had reportedly identified where his body was located. So rescuers had something that families desperately want after an accident like this: a location. They knew approximately where he was. The problem was actually reaching him. Two experienced Sherpa climbers, Pemba Dorje Sherpa and Speed Dai, wow, what a name, were assigned to attempt it. And what happened next tells you almost everything you need to know about the conditions on Broad Peak. They carried approximately 300 meters, nearly 1,000 feet of rope. Now just think about that. You're already above 5,000 meters. You're carrying technical equipment, heavy equipment. You're climbing steep terrain. You're moving directly through an avalanche zone. And you're carrying hundreds of meters of rope because somewhere far above you is one of your fellow climbers. And the remains will need to be dragged down with rope. So they climbed upward, and during that attempt, they were caught in avalanche activity. They survived and also continued. Eventually, they reached the end of the rope. Noang was still higher, so more rope was needed. And one of them went back down. Approximately 120 meters of rope was collected and then came back up. That means after already entering the avalanche path, after already seeing what the mountain was doing, they voluntarily climbed into it again. They extended their lines, and eventually they ran out of rope for a second time. Noang was reportedly still around 150 meters or more above them. And now they were facing terrain so steep that sections were effectively overhanging. They had another problem too. Even if they somehow managed to reach him, how were two men going to safely lower a body through this terrain?
Well, mind-blowing effort, and they had already been exposed to more avalanches by then?
Yes. They, at some point, this actually stopped being a question of determination. It became a question of survival. Pemba Dorje reportedly described the scale of the problem very simply. A recovery like this needed something closer to 8 people. There were only 2, not because the other rescuers didn't want to help, but because the rest of the team was already trying to recover the other victims. Every available person was actually being used. And eventually, those two men had to make one of the hardest decisions a rescuer can make. They turned around. They knew Nguyen was above them. They knew they had come so close. They knew why they had climbed all that way up. But they also knew that continuing could turn a recovery mission into another fatal accident. They thought about their own families, and they realized something. If they pushed further above the point they were at on Broad Peak, that mountain might end up with 2 additional bodies on the mountain. So they descended, and Nguyen's remains are still there. And I think it's important that people understand the difference between giving up and actually recognizing when a mountain has made something totally impossible. Those men did not abandon him. They tried repeatedly, and they went further than almost anyone could reasonably have expected them to go. The other 5? Well, as Pemba, Dorje, and Speed Dai descended, they rejoined the larger recovery effort. Several of the other climbers had been located, and now another extraordinarily difficult job began. That was moving them. A dead body at high altitude is enormously difficult to transport. The person must be secured, wrapped, or packaged, attached to the rope system, lowered meter by meter, and every person involved is working while exhausted, cold, and also exposed to the same objective dangers that caused the original disaster. It's very scary. Eventually, 5 climbers were prepared for descent, but the rescue team realized they were not going to reach their advanced camp safely before conditions worsened. Gosh. So at roughly 5,700 meters, they secured the bodies to the mountain, and the intention was to return. But the rescuers continued downward, and then Broad Peak released again. Another major avalanche came down through the same area, and according to the accounts from the mountain, it swept through the place where those climbers had actually been secured. One body was carried much further down the slope, and there was even an independent witness at Broad Peak at base camp. A trekker staying there with his family described seeing 2 Sherpas searching for the lower avalanche debris. A trekker staying there with his family described seeing 2 Sherpas searching the lower avalanche debris. At approximately 4:30 p.m., another wet slide came down, and with that avalanche, a body wearing an orange suit reportedly reached the valley floor. The Sherpas finally recovered it. Just think about how close the timing was. The rescue team had just left that terrain. Had that avalanche happened any earlier, this tragedy could have become even larger. Eventually, some members of the recovery operation began leaving the mountain, but Mingma Ji stayed. Several climbers still needed to be brought down. And Mingma Gyalje Sherpa, Mingma Ji, remained behind with a small team. And this was one of the parts of the Broad Peak story that I think will be remembered for a very long time. Because if you follow Himalayan mountaineering, you know that Mingma Ji and Nims Purja were 2 enormous personalities in that world. 2 elite climbers, 2 expedition leaders, 2 businessmen, sometimes competitors, sometimes rivals. And yet, when Nims was lying on Broad Peak, none of that mattered. Mingma went back for him, and again, and again. This is something the public misunderstands about mountaineering. You can compete for records, you can compete for clients, you can argue, you can disagree, but when somebody dies on the mountain, all of those things suddenly become very small. Mingma and the remaining team continued working for several more days through dangerous terrain, rockfall, crevasses, avalanche exposure, exhaustion, and eventually the remaining recovered climbers were brought down to Broad Peak Base Camp. Then came the helicopters. Pakistan Army helicopters arrived and began transporting the bodies towards Skardu, and then suddenly, after being trapped for days on one of the world's highest mountains, These men and women were finally leaving Broad Peak. For much of the international media, of course, the biggest story was Nims, and understandably so. Nims Purja was not simply another Himalayan climber. He had become one of the most recognizable faces mountaineering had produced in decades. Project Possible. Everyone thought whatever he was doing was impossible, so he decided to name his endeavors Project Possible, focusing on the positive, on the goal. 14 8,000-meter mountains in 6 months and 6 days. The historic winter ascent of K2 as a part of the Nepali team, the Netflix documentary 14 Peaks, records, expeditions, controversy, admiration, and most of all, criticism. Whatever people thought of Nims, almost everybody in mountaineering knew who exactly he was. And now the man who had spent years climbing the world's highest mountains had to be carried down from one of them. There is something almost painfully symbolic about that. But again, Nims was only one of the 10. And that is why I don't want this final update to become only the story of Nims Purja. We began with Yukta because his journey tells us what all this work was really for. His body was eventually returned to Nepal, and at Swayambhunath in Kathmandu, his family was able to perform his final rites. There were supporters there, people from the climbing community, people who knew him personally, people who respected what he had done, and we have been researching Yukta's life separately because there's so much more to this man than his final expedition. His work, his community, his family, his ambitions, his involvement in mountaineering, the difficult road that took him from his humble beginnings in Nepal to Broad Peak. Now, we will tell that story properly because Yukta Gurung should not only be remembered simply as one of the Sherpas who died with Nims. He was his own person. He had his own life and his own legacy. Unfortunately, this is where the story becomes painful again, because not everybody could be brought home. Sohail Saki's remains have not been located. He is believed to remain somewhere within the avalanche debris, and anyone who has seen the aftermath of a large mountain avalanche understands how enormous that search area can become. Snow, ice, rock, broken glacier debris, everything moves together. Everything comes down right on top of you in a split second. A person can be buried meters beneath the surface, and sometimes remains emerge weeks later, sometimes years later, and sometimes never. And Sohail's family now faces that uncertainty. Then there is Noang Tindu Sherpa. His location was reportedly identified through drone reconnaissance. Men actually climbed toward him. They carried hundreds of meters of rope. They went back for more. They survived the avalanche activity, and still they could not safely reach him. So Noang remains high on Broad Peak. And then there is Mallory Geis. Initial remains associated with Mallory were recovered, but according to the more detailed information surrounding the recovery operation, not all her remains could be brought from the mountain. And that distinction matters. When we hear the number 8 recovered, it can sound complete, but the reality of a major avalanche is often far more complicated.
And now, with the operation ending, those families really don't know when or whether another recovery will ever be possible.
Exactly. And that may be one of the hardest realities of high altitude mountaineering. Sometimes the mountain becomes the grave. Maybe changing conditions eventually expose somebody. Maybe another expedition finds them years later. Maybe technology makes another attempt possible. But there are no guarantees. And for now, the mountain has won that argument. There is a quote from one of the rescuers that I think captures this entire story. The point he was making was essentially this. Everybody will remember Broad Peak because Nims Purja died there, but people also need to remember the men who brought him down. And I think he's absolutely right, because consider what these people actually did. They weren't climbing for a summit. They weren't climbing for a sponsorship. They weren't chasing a record. Nobody was standing at base camp offering them a medal. They went up because 10 people had died and families were waiting. They walked into the same avalanche terrain. They carried the rope, they carried their probes, they searched with those probes, they moved bodies. They were caught in avalanches and they returned for more equipment when they ran out. They spent days in terrain where a single mistake could have added their own names to the casualty list. And that's a very scary thought. And then when they reached base camp, there was no celebration. It was quiet. It was sad. There was simply another job to do. And that was to prepare the bodies, coordinate the helicopters, and then send them home. That is why I think the rescue operation may ultimately become one of the defining stories of Broad Peak 2026. A rescue while there's active avalanches. Wow. We also have to acknowledge the Pakistan Army aviation crews. They were flying helicopters in the Karakoram. It's not routine aviation. High altitude reduces aircraft performance dramatically. Weather can change quickly, landing zones are difficult, and mountains create unpredictable wind. And every flight has limitations. There were also Pakistani climbers. There were Nepali Sherpas, drone teams, base camp staff, expedition operators. People in Skardu were also coordinating the logistics. Embassies were also helping with the repatriation. Families were making arrangements thousands of kilometers away. There are almost certainly people involved in this recovery operation whose names we will never hear. But without them, some of these climbers might still be on Broad Peak today. So, what happens now? The rescue operation is essentially finished for the season. The recovered climbers are being repatriated. Families are beginning funeral ceremonies and memorials. Yukta has already been cremated in Kathmandu. Nims is going through the process of being returned. The other climbers are being returned to their respective families and countries. And eventually the international mountaineering community will move into another phase. And that is more questions, a larger investigation, the analysis. And there are many questions that still deserve answers. What were conditions really like on July 30th? How much fresh snow had fallen? What was the avalanche danger? And were there warning signs? What information was available to those different expedition teams? Why were so many people exposed to the same slope? Could communication between base camp and climbers have been better? Could anything realistically have prevented what happened? Those are questions we will continue examining, because respecting the people who died does not mean avoiding difficult questions. In fact, learning from what happened may be one of the most meaningful ways to respect them. But those questions are for another report. Today, I think we need to stop at something more fundamental. 10 people died on Broad Peak. 10 different stories, 10 different families. 10 people who woke up that morning believing there would be another morning. And the danger when somebody famous dies alongside less famous people is that history compresses the entire tragedy into one name. The avalanche that killed Nims Dai. That is probably how millions of people will remember it. But I hope our audience remembers more. Remember Yukta Gurung. Remember Sohail Saki. Remember Mallory Geis. Remember Nuang Tindu Sherpa. Remember Nadira. Remember Wang Zhong. Remember Nima. Remember Gaialu. And remember Kilu. And remember every person whose life ended on that slope. Because nobody becomes less important simply because somebody standing beside them was more famous. And finally, remember the rescuers. When those 10 people disappeared beneath the avalanche on July 30th, other people had a choice. They could look at that mountain, look at unstable snow, look at the rockfall, look at the avalanche debris and say, it's way too dangerous. And nobody could reasonably have been blamed. Instead, they packed rope, they put on their equipment, they stepped onto Broad Peak and started climbing toward the dead. One rescuer reportedly summarized it beautifully. People will write about those who died, but we should also remember those who brought them home. And after everything we have reported over these last several days, I think that maybe the line that he just said stays with me the most. Because the summit is not always the highest expression of mountaineering. Sometimes it is turning around because another life matters more than the objective. Sometimes it is risking yourself for someone who can no longer thank you. And sometimes the greatest thing you can accomplish on a mountain is simply bringing somebody home. Yukta Gurung finally came home. His family performed his final rites. Others have now begun their own final journeys, and some remain on Broad Peak. And perhaps one day, the mountain will return them too. For now, this is likely our final major update on the Broad Peak avalanche of July 30th, 2026. Our deepest condolences remain with every family that lost someone. Our deepest respect goes to every person who participated in bringing these climbers down. This tragedy began with 10 lives lost, but its final chapter, at least for now, belongs to the people who went back up.
And may they all rest in peace.
Yes, and may we remember not only how they died, but who they were before the mountain took them. Thank you for staying with us through this story.
Until next time.
We'll see you in the next one. This is Reembok Arcane, and I'm Rima, your friendly neighborhood storyteller. Make sure to subscribe below. We'll see you in the next one, guys.